Sometimes the one bleeding in the snow is not the one who needs saving the most. The wind howled across the pine-covered mountains of northern Montana with a voice that sounded older than memory itself, carrying sharp crystals of snow that stung exposed skin and erased every footprint within minutes. Midnight had swallowed the narrow forest road hours earlier, leaving only darkness, towering evergreens, and the distant groan of frozen branches bending beneath fresh snow. Nearly everyone in Black Ridge had locked their doors before sunset, knowing no sensible traveler remained outside once the winter storm reached full strength. Yet one battered police SUV fought its way through the blizzard, headlights cutting narrow tunnels through endless sheets of white before disappearing into the storm again. Officer Emily Carter gripped the steering wheel with one trembling hand while the other desperately held a blood-soaked emergency blanket against the body lying across her passenger seat. She was 31, a white American police officer with tired blue eyes, pale skin reddened by freezing wind, and blonde hair escaping from beneath her winter patrol cap. Her uniform jacket was streaked with melting snow and dark stains that were not entirely her own. Every few seconds, she glanced toward the German shepherd lying beside her. The large sable-coated dog barely moved. His breathing came in shallow, painful bursts, each one fogging the inside of the windshield before fading into silence that lasted just a little too long. Blood continued soaking through the thick blanket wrapped around his shoulder. Emily pressed harder, whispering words she wasn't sure the dog could still hear. "Stay with me. Please, just a little longer." The German shepherd slowly opened one amber eye. Instead of looking at her, he stared through the windshield into the swirling darkness ahead, as though searching for someone hidden beyond the storm. Then he gave the faintest whine, weak enough to disappear beneath the roar of the wind. Emily felt her chest tighten. 20 minutes earlier, she had found him lying beside an abandoned logging road nearly buried beneath fresh snow. No collar, no identification, no nearby vehicle. No human footprints, only blood staining the snow and a single trail of paw prints leading away into the forest before vanishing beneath the blizzard. Dispatch had instructed her to leave the animal for wildlife rescue once morning arrived. Instead, she ignored protocol. Something about the dog's eyes refused to let her drive away. They were not pleading for help. They were pleading for time. The nearest veterinary clinic had already closed before the storm intensified. The county emergency shelter could offer blankets, but little else. Then Emily remembered an old story passed around the sheriff's department whenever rookies complained about impossible winter rescues. There was a retired Navy SEAL living alone nearly 12 miles beyond town. Daniel Brooks. People claimed he had saved stranded hikers, lost children, even injured horses during blizzards when rescue teams could no longer reach them. Others said he simply knew more about surviving impossible conditions than anyone else in the county. Emily had never met him. Tonight she had no better option. The SUV finally turned onto a narrow snow-covered driveway, winding uphill through dense pines. Tire chains rattled against hidden ice, while the engine struggled with every steep curve. At the very top of the ridge, a small log cabin emerged from the storm, its windows glowing softly with warm amber light that looked almost unreal against the endless white landscape. Smoke drifted steadily from the stone chimney despite the violent wind. Emily pulled to a stop so abruptly that snow sprayed across the porch steps. She climbed out into knee-deep drifts, immediately feeling the freezing wind tear through every layer of clothing. Carefully, she lifted the heavy German shepherd into her arms. He was larger than she expected, muscular despite obvious exhaustion, his thick winter coat matted with blood along one shoulder and streaked with ice crystals clinging to his fur. Even injured, he felt powerful. Yet he never struggled. He simply rested his head weakly against Emily's arm while staring toward the cabin door with quiet intensity. Each step through the deep snow felt heavier than the last. By the time she reached the porch, her breathing had become ragged and her arms trembled beneath the dog's weight. She pounded on the wooden door with the side of her fist. Once, twice, 3 times. Only the wind answered. Emily closed her eyes for one hopeless moment. Then she heard footsteps approaching from inside. Slow, measured. The deadbolt clicked. The heavy oak door opened just enough for warm firelight to spill across the snow-covered porch. A tall man stood in the doorway wearing a faded gray flannel shirt beneath a weathered canvas jacket. He looked to be in his early 40s, with short dark brown hair touched by streaks of gray, a neatly trimmed beard, broad shoulders, and calm hazel eyes that studied everything before speaking. Daniel Brooks had the quiet posture of someone who had spent a lifetime making impossible decisions without wasting unnecessary words. His gaze moved from Emily's snow-covered uniform to the bleeding German shepherd in her arms. Something changed in his expression instantly. Not panic. Recognition. He stepped aside without asking a single question. Bring him inside. Emily crossed the threshold into the warmth of the cabin where the scent of burning cedar mixed with fresh coffee and old leather. A crackling fireplace painted golden light across rough timber walls lined with books, maps, climbing ropes, and framed military photographs. Daniel cleared a heavy wooden table with one sweep of his arm before gently helping Emily lay the wounded dog across thick wool blankets. Only then did he kneel beside the animal, his steady hands already examining the injury with practiced precision. The German shepherd slowly lifted his head despite the pain. Their eyes met for only a second. The dog did not growl. Daniel did not speak. Yet something silent passed between them, something older than trust and deeper than instinct. Outside, the blizzard continued burying the mountain beneath fresh snow. Inside, as the fire crackled softly against the growing silence, none of them noticed that melting ice dripping from the German shepherd's fur carried tiny flecks of dark red onto the cabin floor, forming a trail that pointed not toward the door they had entered, but back toward the forest where the storm was already beginning to hide far more than blood. The dog had not come to the cabin to be saved. It had come to save someone else. Daniel Brooks worked in complete silence, the kind of silence earned after years of making life-or-death decisions where panic only buried more people. He carefully cut away the frozen fur surrounding the German shepherd's wounded shoulder, revealing a deep gash running across the thick muscle beneath. The injury was ugly but surprisingly clean, as though caused by sharp metal instead of an animal attack. Blood still seeped slowly from the wound despite the freezing temperatures outside. Emily stood nearby with her gloves clenched tightly in one hand, watching Daniel's every movement. "Can you save him?" she asked quietly. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He poured warm, sterile water across the wound, washing away layers of frozen blood until fresh crimson stained the towel beneath the dog. The German shepherd never snapped, never growled. He only breathed harder, his amber eyes fixed not on Daniel's hands, but toward the cabin windows where snow continued piling against the glass. Finally, Daniel tied the final stitch and wrapped a clean pressure bandage around the shoulder before leaning back with a slow breath. "He's strong," he said. "Whoever he belongs to took good care of him." Emily looked relieved for barely a second before another question replaced it. "Will he make it?" Daniel rested one gentle hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his fingers. "If infection stays away." Then he looked directly at Emily. "The bigger question is why an animal this well-trained was alone in the middle of a blizzard." Emily nodded slowly. She had wondered the same thing ever since discovering the dog beside the deserted logging road. "No collar," she said. "No microchip scanner in my cruiser. No tire tracks. No footprints. Just blood." Daniel frowned. "No human footprints?" "None." He looked toward the dog again. "That's impossible." Emily tilted her head. Daniel stood and walked toward the wood stove, placing a kettle over the fire while thinking aloud. Snow records everything. If someone carried an injured dog there should have been tracks. If the dog walked there alone, there should have been tracks. Unless... He stopped speaking. Emily noticed his expression change. "Unless what?" Daniel looked toward the storm outside. "Unless the snowfall buried them before you arrived." The German shepherd suddenly lifted his head. Every muscle beneath his thick sable coat tightened. His ears stood perfectly erect despite obvious pain. He stared directly at the cabin door. Daniel noticed instantly. "Easy boy." The dog ignored him. A low whine escaped his throat. Then another. He struggled to stand. His injured front leg collapsed beneath him. Even so, he tried again. Emily hurried forward. "Don't move. You're going to tear the stitches." The German shepherd looked at her for only an instant before turning back toward the door. His breathing became quicker, not from pain, from urgency. Daniel watched quietly. Military working dogs behaved exactly like this during deployments whenever they detected unfinished danger. They ignored discomfort completely. Pain disappeared beneath purpose. Daniel knelt beside him again. "You're trying to tell us something." The dog stared into Daniel's hazel eyes. There was no fear inside them, only determination. Daniel slowly opened the cabin door. Freezing wind burst inside immediately, carrying fresh snow across the wooden floor. The German Shepherd attempted to rise once more. This time Daniel slipped one arm beneath his chest, supporting his weight. The dog limped forward until reaching the porch. There he stopped. His nose lifted toward the dark forest. He inhaled deeply once, twice. Then he gave a single sharp bark that echoed through the sleeping mountains before trying to pull away from Daniel's grip. "He wants to go back," Emily whispered. Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off the woods. "Not once." He paused. "Needs." For several long moments, all three remained motionless while snow drifted silently around them. The forest beyond the cabin appeared completely empty. Towering pines bent beneath heavy white blankets. Wind pushed loose powder across the frozen ground like waves rolling across an invisible ocean. Nothing moved. Yet the German Shepherd continued staring toward the same narrow gap between two distant trees. Daniel finally guided him gently back inside before closing the door against the storm. "He's not ready to travel." Emily sighed. "Then whatever he's trying to show us will have to wait until morning." Daniel did not answer. Instead, he walked toward the mudroom sink, rinsing dried blood from his hands. Something caught his attention immediately. On the wooden floor near the doorway, small drops of melted snow had mixed with dark red stains dripping from the dog's coat earlier. Most had spread naturally. One had not. A tiny white object rested inside the melting ice. Daniel picked it up carefully between two fingers. It was no larger than his thumbnail. Emily stepped closer. "What is it?" Daniel wiped away the moisture with a clean cloth. Under the cabin light, the object gleamed faintly. It was a fragment of white automotive paint with a thin scratch of dark blue running across one edge. Fresh paint. Not weathered. Not old. Embedded within the paint was a tiny splinter of clear safety glass. Daniel looked toward the bandaged German Shepherd, then toward the forest outside. "He wasn't attacked by an animal," he said quietly. Emily felt the room grow colder despite the crackling fire. "Then what happened?" Daniel placed the paint fragment carefully onto the kitchen table beside a folded map of the surrounding mountains. "Someone hit a vehicle, or tried to hide one." Before either of them could say another word, the German Shepherd suddenly growled. Deep, low, controlled. His eyes locked onto the cabin window overlooking the snowy driveway. Daniel followed his gaze. For the briefest moment, through swirling snow illuminated by the porch light, he thought he saw the faint outline of fresh tire tracks crossing the driveway. Then the wind swept across them, erasing everything as though the mountain itself had decided that whatever had come looking for the wounded dog was not yet ready to be seen. The storm tried to erase the truth before morning, but the dog had already memorized where it was buried. Daniel stood beside the cabin window long after the faint tire tracks disappeared beneath wind-blown snow, his eyes fixed on the driveway, as if silence itself might confess. Emily moved to the other side of the room and checked her radio again. Static answered. The storm had swallowed the signal completely. On the blanket near the fireplace, the wounded German Shepherd lay with his head lifted, refusing sleep. Daniel had wrapped him carefully, warmed him, stitched him, and set food within reach, but the dog ignored everything except the darkness beyond the glass. "He needs a name," Emily said softly, more to break the tension than anything else. Daniel glanced down at the dog. The animal's sable coat carried dark shadows along his back and warm brown at the chest, like firelight trapped beneath winter. His amber eyes never softened, not even in pain. "Shadow," Daniel said. The dog's ears twitched. Emily looked at him. "You think that's his name?" "No," Daniel replied. But he answered. Shadow gave a weak huff, then pushed his nose toward the door again. Daniel crouched beside him, checking the bandage. No fresh bleeding. The stitches held, though barely. "You make this worse, boy, and whatever you're trying to show us dies with you." Shadow stared at him with infuriating patience, the way trained dogs sometimes did when humans were the slow ones. Emily exhaled, then zipped her jacket. "If we wait until morning, the snow could bury everything." Daniel stood slowly. "It already has." He moved toward a gear cabinet near the back wall and opened it. Inside were neatly arranged items that told Emily more about him than any introduction had. Emergency rope, climbing harnesses, thermal blankets, signal flares, snowshoes, a compact medical kit, headlamps, and an old Navy field compass polished from years of use. He handed her a headlamp. We go short range. No heroics. 10 minutes out, 10 back. If visibility drops, we turn around. Emily nodded, grateful for the clarity in his voice. Daniel fashioned a supportive sling from padded rescue webbing and fitted it beneath Shadow's chest to keep weight off the injured shoulder. The German shepherd did not resist. The moment the cabin door opened, the storm rushed in like a living thing. Snow struck their faces, cold and sharp. Daniel stepped first, Shadow close beside him, Emily following with one hand near her service flashlight. The porch light faded behind them after only 30 yards. The world became white noise, black trees, and the steady pull of a wounded dog who should not have been able to walk at all. Shadow led them toward the narrow gap between two pines he had stared at earlier. He moved slowly but with absolute certainty, pausing every few yards to lift his nose and read since the storm had not fully stolen. Daniel watched him carefully, supporting the sling when the dog stumbled. He's tracking through snowfall, Emily whispered. That shouldn't be possible. It's not impossible, Daniel said. Just expensive. Costs him pain every step. After nearly 8 minutes, Shadow stopped beside a shallow dip in the forest floor where wind had packed snow into a smooth white sheet. He lowered his head and began scraping at one spot with his good paw. Emily knelt and brushed snow away with gloved hands. At first there was nothing. Then her fingers struck plastic. She dug faster. A cracked police radio emerged from beneath the snow, its casing crushed, antenna snapped clean off. Emily went still. That's not mine. Daniel's eyes narrowed. County issue. She nodded. Same model. But ours are assigned. Shadow whined and dragged himself 3 feet farther to another mound beneath a fallen branch. Daniel uncovered it this time. A torn strip of dark fabric appeared, stiff with ice. On one edge, silver embroidery caught the beam of his headlamp. Black Ridge Police. Emily's face changed. The storm, the dog, the paint fragment, the radio, all of it drew together into something colder than weather. Deputy Mark Ellis never checked in after his evening patrol, she said. Dispatch thought he'd lost signal in the storm. Daniel looked into the trees. Maybe he found something before he lost it. Shadow suddenly stiffened. His growl rolled low through the wind. Daniel killed his headlamp instantly and signaled Emily down. A faint mechanical sound drifted through the storm. Not close, but not far. An engine idling somewhere deeper in the woods. Then came the soft pulse of reverse lights glowing red through the trees before vanishing behind blowing snow. Someone was moving slowly along the old logging road without headlights. Emily's hand tightened around her flashlight. Could be rescue. Daniel shook his head once. Rescue doesn't hide its lights. Shadow pulled forward again, harder this time, nearly collapsing when pain hit him. Daniel caught him before he fell. No farther, he whispered. Shadow looked up at him, and for the first time the dog's expression shifted. Not frustration. Grief. He turned his head toward the darkness where the red lights had disappeared and released a sound so soft it barely survived the wind. A plea. Emily swallowed. Daniel, he followed her gaze. Half buried beneath the snow beside the broken radio was something they had missed at first, a shallow drag mark leading away from the clearing, already filling with powder, but still visible enough to show direction. It led toward the old logging road, toward the hidden engine, toward whoever had tried to bury a crime beneath the storm. Daniel reached down and lifted Shadow carefully, ignoring the dog's weak protest. We go back now. Emily looked shocked. But Mark could still be out there. And if we follow blind, all 4 of us disappear. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. We need signal, warmth, and a plan. As they turned back toward the cabin, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. A tree branch snapping under snow, maybe. Or something else. Shadow barked once, sudden and urgent. Daniel shoved Emily behind a thick pine just as a dark pickup rolled across the logging road ahead, its headlights still off, its tires crushing fresh snow with careful, deliberate weight. For one frozen second, the truck paused. A man inside looked toward the trees. Daniel held Shadow against his chest, one hand over the dog's muzzle, feeling the animal's heart hammer beneath the bandage. Then the pickup moved on, disappearing into the storm. Only after its engine faded did Daniel breathe again. In Shadow's fur, caught near the torn edge of the bandage, a tiny shard of blue reflective tape glimmered under Emily's lamp. The same dark blue as the paint fragment on Daniel's table. The snow had not shown them the whole crime yet. It had only given them the first witness. The snow was hiding a man, but the dog refused to let him disappear. Daniel did not speak until the cabin lights came back into view through the storm. Only then did he ease Shadow onto the thick wool blankets beside the fireplace and carefully remove the rescue sling. The German shepherd's breathing had become uneven again, his injured shoulder trembling from the effort of leading them through the forest. Emily immediately fetched warm water while Daniel examined the fresh strain on the stitches. One had begun to seep blood again, though far less than he feared. "You almost tore everything open," Daniel murmured, tightening the bandage with practiced hands. Shadow did not even glance at the wound. His eyes remained fixed on the cabin window overlooking the mountain road. Emily noticed it too. "He still thinks someone is out there." Daniel nodded. "No." He gently rested one hand against the dog's neck. "He knows someone is." Silence settled over the cabin except for the crackling cedar logs inside the stone fireplace. Outside, the wind continued throwing snow against the windows with relentless determination. Emily finally managed to raise dispatch through intermittent static, but the connection lasted only seconds. Black Ridge Dispatch. Officer Carter. Possible missing deputy. Evidence located. The signal dissolved into white noise before anyone could answer. She lowered the radio with quiet frustration. Nothing. Daniel spread the recovered items across the heavy wooden table. The broken police radio, the torn Black Ridge police uniform patch, the blue reflective tape caught in Shadow's fur, and the tiny fragment of white automotive paint containing a sliver of shattered safety glass. He studied each piece without touching them again. Years as a Navy SEAL had taught him that evidence spoke best when left undisturbed. Emily leaned over the table. "You really think these are connected?" Daniel pointed first at the paint fragment. "Fresh impact." Then at the broken radio. "Destroyed intentionally." Nobody accidentally crushes a police radio this completely. His finger stopped over the torn uniform cloth. And fabric tears outward when someone is dragged, not when they fall. Emily looked down at the objects with growing disbelief. "You're saying Deputy Ellis wasn't lost in the storm?" Daniel met her eyes. "I'm saying someone wanted everyone to believe he was." Shadow suddenly lifted his head. Not toward the window this time. Toward the fireplace. He slowly struggled onto 3 legs and limped across the cabin until he stopped beside Daniel's old wooden boot rack near the back door. He sniffed one particular pair of insulated snow boots before nudging them repeatedly with his nose. Daniel frowned. "What is it?" The dog pawed once at the floor beneath the rack. Emily crouched and swept away a thin layer of melting snow that had fallen from their clothing earlier. Underneath lay several tiny pine needles mixed with reddish mud. Daniel's expression sharpened instantly. "That shouldn't be here." Emily looked confused. "Why?" Daniel picked up one of the pine needles. "These aren't lodgepole pine." He held it beneath the lantern. "They're blue spruce." Emily shrugged. "There are trees everywhere. Not around this cabin." Daniel walked to a wall map hanging beside the fireplace. The mountains surrounding Black Ridge were marked with old forestry survey notes. He traced one valley with his finger. Blue spruce only grows naturally on the north side of Miller Canyon because of the elevation and groundwater. Emily followed the map. "That's near the abandoned logging operation." Daniel nodded once. "The same direction Shadow led us." He looked toward the dog. He picked those needles up before he reached the cabin. Shadow quietly wagged his tail once, almost imperceptibly, as though confirming the deduction. Emily crossed her arms, thinking aloud. Deputy Ellis disappears. Shadow is injured somewhere near Miller Canyon. Someone drives through the storm without headlights. And now we know the dog came from the same area. Daniel stared into the fire for several seconds. "There's one piece missing." Emily waited. "If someone committed a crime out there." He looked toward Shadow again. "Why didn't they shoot the witness?" Emily blinked. "The witness." Daniel gently scratched behind Shadow's ears. "Dogs remember scents. Faces. Vehicles. Routes." He paused. Whoever hurt him left him alive. Before Emily could answer, a sudden knock echoed through the cabin. 3 slow knocks. Deliberate. Every sound inside the room stopped. Shadow's ears snapped upright. A deep growl rolled through his chest, unlike anything either of them had heard before. Daniel extinguished the nearest lantern immediately, leaving only the dim glow of the fireplace. He motioned Emily away from the front windows. The knock came again. 3 measured strikes against solid oak. Not desperate. Not frightened. Patient. Daniel quietly retrieved an old pair of field binoculars from a shelf and moved toward a narrow side window overlooking the porch instead of approaching the front door directly. He lifted the binoculars carefully. Through the swirling snow stood a man wrapped in a heavy winter parka, his face hidden beneath a fur-lined hood. One gloved hand rested casually inside his coat pocket. Beside him sat a white pickup truck dusted with fresh snow. Daniel's eyes narrowed. The truck's left front fender carried a long scrape where white paint had been freshly damaged. Along the edge of that scrape ran a thin dark blue reflective stripe, exactly like the paint fragment lying on the table. Daniel lowered the binoculars without speaking. Emily quietly drew her service pistol, but kept it pointed toward the floor. "Do you know him?" she whispered. Daniel answered with barely audible words. "No." He glanced toward Shadow. The German Shepherd was no longer growling. He had become perfectly silent, every muscle rigid, eyes burning toward the front door with unmistakable recognition. Daniel looked back through the window one final time. The stranger slowly smiled beneath the shadow of his hood, then lifted his free hand. Hanging from his fingers was a polished silver sheriff's badge glinting beneath the porch light. The badge at the door should have meant safety, but Shadow looked at it like a warning carved from silver. Daniel remained beside the side window, watching the hooded man on the porch stand perfectly still beneath the storm, one gloved hand holding the sheriff's badge just high enough for the light to catch it. Emily's face had gone pale. Not frightened pale. Recognition pale. "That's Sheriff Nolan Briggs," she whispered. "He runs the county." Daniel did not move. "Does he usually visit cabins at midnight in a damaged truck?" Emily swallowed. No, the knock came again, harder this time, rattling the old oak door in its frame. "Officer Carter," the sheriff called through the storm, his voice muffled but calm. "Open up. Dispatch lost contact. I came to check on you." The words sounded reasonable, almost kind. That made Daniel trust them even less. Shadow stood low near the table, wounded shoulder trembling, eyes fixed on the door with a hatred no animal could fake. Daniel looked at the evidence spread across the wood, the crushed police radio, the torn uniform patch, the blue reflective tape, the paint fragment, and understood something cold and simple. The man outside had not come to rescue Emily. He had come to see what she knew. Emily lifted her radio again, but only static answered. Daniel gestured toward the back hallway. "Kitchen window." Quietly, she shook her head. "If that's really him, I can't just run from my own sheriff." Daniel stepped close, voice low. "You are not running from a badge. You're moving away from the man holding it." Another silence. Then she nodded. Daniel crossed to the fireplace and kicked ash over the brightest logs, dimming the room. "Officer Carter," Briggs called again, sharper now. "I know Brooks is in there. I know the dog is too. That animal may be carrying evidence from an active investigation. Open the door before this becomes obstruction." Shadow growled at the word animal. Daniel almost smiled despite the danger. He moved to the door, but did not open it. "Sheriff," he called back. "Dog's injured. Officers warming up. Road's bad. Come back with a warrant and a vet." The porch went quiet. Snow scraped along the steps. "You don't want to play soldier with me, Brooks." Daniel's eyes hardened. "I stopped playing soldier a long time ago." Behind him, Emily eased the kitchen window open. Cold air slipped in. She climbed out first, landing softly into deep snow beside the woodpile. Daniel gathered the evidence into a canvas pouch, tucked it inside Emily's spare duty jacket, then returned to Shadow. "Can you move?" The German Shepherd looked at him as if insulted by the question. Daniel fitted the support sling beneath him again. The front door suddenly exploded inward with a brutal crack, not from a gunshot, but from a heavy boot driving near the lock. Wood splintered across the floor. Briggs stepped into the cabin with 2 deputies behind him, all wearing winter gear, all moving with the confidence of men who believe the mountain belonged to them. "Hands where I can see them," Briggs ordered. But Daniel and Shadow were no longer in the front room. They slipped through the dark kitchen as Briggs's flashlight swept across the empty blankets, and scattered medical supplies. Daniel climbed through the window after Emily, supporting Shadow carefully as the dog dropped into the snow. They moved downhill behind the cabin, using stacked firewood and the slope of the ridge to hide from the porch light. Briggs shouted from inside, "They're out back." A beam of light slashed across the trees. Emily started toward her SUV, but Daniel pulled her the opposite way. "They'll block the road." "Then where?" she whispered. Daniel pointed toward a dark line of pines descending into the ravine. "Miller Canyon." Emily stared. "That's where the crime scene is." "Exactly." They plunged into the trees as the storm swallowed their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. Shadow moved between them, limping but relentless, guided by a purpose stronger than pain. Behind them, men shouted. An engine roared to life. The white pickup turned around near the cabin, headlights finally cutting through the forest. Daniel led them down a steep animal trail he knew from years of winter survival practice, one hand gripping Shadow's sling, the other steadying Emily whenever ice stole her footing. After nearly 15 minutes, the shouts faded behind the wind. Then Shadow stopped. He turned sharply toward a cluster of blue spruce trees leaning over a frozen drainage ditch. His nose dropped to the snow. He sniffed once, then gave a soft, broken whine. Emily aimed her flashlight downward. Beneath a thin crust of fresh powder, something dark formed a straight line across the white ground. Daniel knelt and brushed snow aside. Tire tracks. Wide. Recent. Matching the white pickup. Shadow dragged himself forward and began digging near the ditch with his good paw. Daniel helped with gloved hands, clearing snow until metal appeared beneath the surface. Not a vehicle. A door handle. Emily gasped. Together they uncovered the side of a dark county patrol SUV buried under branches and packed snow. Its windshield was cracked. Its radio antenna was broken. The driver's door was dented inward, and on the snow beside it lay a smear of frozen blood leading toward the trees. Emily pressed one hand over her mouth. "Mark." Daniel shone his flashlight through the broken window. The driver's seat was empty, but across the dashboard, scratched into the frost with what looked like trembling fingers, were 3 letters, BRG. Briggs. Shadow stared at the name and released one low, wounded growl. At that moment, far above them on the ridge, the white pickup's headlights appeared between the trees. The sheriff had followed them, and now the snow had finally exposed the first part of his crime. A loyal dog never follows fear. He follows the heartbeat he refuses to abandon. Daniel watched the sheriff's headlights drift between the snow-covered pines until they disappeared behind the ridge, but he knew Nolan Briggs was not leaving. Predators rarely abandoned wounded prey. They simply widened the circle. The frozen patrol SUV rested half buried beneath broken spruce branches like a coffin the mountain had refused to keep. Snow continued falling across its shattered windshield, yet the 3 letters scratched into the frost remained painfully clear. BRG. Emily brushed trembling fingers across the dashboard without disturbing the message. "Mark knew who attacked him," she whispered. Daniel nodded but kept scanning the trees instead of the vehicle. Or he knew who was coming. Shadow limped toward the driver's door despite the strain on his injured shoulder. His nose traced the cracked metal, then moved along the frozen blood leading away from the SUV. He stopped suddenly beside a snow-covered boulder and began sniffing with renewed urgency. Daniel joined him, kneeling carefully beside the dog. The blood trail did not end here. It disappeared beneath a fresh blanket of snow covering the narrow drainage channel. "Wind drift," Daniel murmured. The storm buried the rest. Emily knelt opposite him. "Can we still follow it?" Daniel looked at Shadow. The German shepherd lifted his head, inhaled deeply, and turned toward the deeper woods. His amber eyes held the same determined fire Daniel had seen since the moment Emily carried him into the cabin. "He already is," Daniel answered. They moved slowly through the forest, Shadow leading despite every painful step. Daniel supported him whenever the dog stumbled, refusing to let pride reopen the wound. Emily followed close behind, marking their direction on a handheld GPS that struggled beneath heavy cloud cover. The snowfall had eased, replaced by a strange stillness that settled over the canyon. Every sound seemed louder now. Boots compressing snow, the soft jingle of Daniel's climbing carabiners, Shadow's measured breathing. Somewhere above, a raven called once before silence returned. After nearly 15 minutes, Shadow froze. His ears stood perfectly erect. Daniel immediately crouched and motioned Emily down. Ahead, partially hidden among towering blue spruce trees, stood an old ranger cabin abandoned decades earlier after the logging operation closed. Its roof sagged beneath heavy snow. One window was broken. A thin ribbon of gray smoke drifted lazily from the chimney. Someone was inside. Daniel studied the cabin through binoculars. Curtains covered most of the windows, but faint movement crossed behind the cracked glass. One person, maybe two. He lowered the binoculars. Sheriff's truck isn't here. Emily frowned. Then who? Before Daniel could answer, Shadow pulled sharply toward the cabin. Not recklessly, purposefully. Then he released a soft whine unlike any sound he had made before. Daniel rested one hand on the dog's neck. You know who's in there. Shadow looked back at him, then toward the cabin again. The answer was unmistakable. They circled quietly until reaching the rear wall, where stacked firewood nearly reached the broken window. Daniel eased himself upward just enough to look inside. The room was dimly lit by a kerosene lantern. An injured man lay tied to an old bed frame beneath thick blankets, one arm heavily bandaged, face bruised but unmistakable. Deputy Mark Ellis. His eyes were closed. A portable heater hummed beside him. No guard stood nearby. Emily covered her mouth to stop herself from speaking. Relief and disbelief collided across her face. Daniel scanned the room carefully. No movement beyond the deputy. No hidden figures. He slipped through the broken window first, landing silently inside. Emily followed seconds later while Shadow remained outside, watching the tree line. Daniel cut the ropes, binding Mark's wrists. The deputy's eyes fluttered open slowly. Confusion gave way to recognition. Emily, he whispered hoarsely. Don't trust. His voice broke into a painful cough. Daniel handed him water. Easy. Mark struggled to sit upright. Briggs. He breathed. He wasn't alone. Daniel leaned closer. Who else? Mark swallowed with obvious effort. County Commissioner. Victor Hale. Illegal land deal. Old mining claims. I found the documents in Briggs's truck. His breathing quickened. They forced me off the road, thought I died. Emily stared at him. Why keep you alive? Mark managed a bitter smile. Needed to know. Who else I'd told. A sharp bark exploded outside. Shadow. Not frantic. Warning. Daniel extinguished the lantern instantly. Through the broken window, he saw headlights weaving between the trees. 2 vehicles this time. Briggs had brought help. Engines stopped outside the clearing. Doors opened. Men's voices drifted through the snow. Search the cabin, one shouted. Shadow barked again, farther away now, deliberately moving through the forest. Daniel understood immediately. The German shepherd was drawing them away. Emily realized it too. He's distracting them. Daniel's jaw tightened. Every instinct screamed at him to go after the dog. But Mark could barely stand, and the evidence of the conspiracy now lived inside the deputy's memory. Shadow had made the choice for them. Daniel slipped one arm beneath Mark while Emily supported his other side. Together they guided the wounded deputy toward a narrow trapdoor hidden beneath a faded rug in the corner of the cabin. Mark pointed weakly downward. Old, supply tunnel, leads to the frozen creek. Daniel lifted the hatch. Cold air rose from the darkness below. Behind them came the unmistakable crash of the front cabin door being kicked open. Briggs's voice echoed through the room. Find the deputy. Daniel lowered Mark carefully into the tunnel while Emily climbed after him. Just before following, Daniel looked once through the broken window. Far beyond the trees, Shadow sprinted across the untouched snow, limping yet impossibly fast, his wounded shoulder leaving faint drops of crimson behind him. Every man in Briggs's search party chased the German shepherd, believing the dog was simply fleeing. Only Daniel understood the truth. Shadow was not running to save himself. He was buying time for the people he had already decided were worth more than his own life. Some heroes do not stand their ground. Some run into the dark, so everyone else can live long enough to see the dawn. Daniel dropped into the old supply tunnel just as Briggs and his men stormed through the ranger cabin above them, their boots hammering against the floorboards like a countdown. Emily moved ahead on her knees, pulling Deputy Mark Ellis through the narrow passage, while Daniel lowered the trapdoor until only a thin seam of lantern light remained. The tunnel smelled of frozen earth, old timber, and water that had slept too long beneath stone. Every breath became a small cloud in the darkness. Mark groaned once, and Emily whispered for him to hold on, her voice breaking but steady enough to keep him conscious. Above them, Briggs shouted orders. Furniture scraped. A cabinet crashed. Then another voice yelled from outside. The dog went east. Footsteps thundered away from the cabin. Daniel paused in the tunnel, every muscle in his body fighting the same impossible command. Go after Shadow. Protect the witness. Go after Shadow. Protect the living. Emily looked back at him through the darkness, understanding before he spoke. Daniel. He shook his head once, not trusting himself with words. Shadow had made the choice. Daniel had to honor it. They crawled forward, following the tunnel as it sloped downward beneath the roots of ancient blue spruce trees. The walls narrowed until Daniel's shoulders brushed both sides. In front of him, Mark's breathing grew ragged. Files, the deputy whispered. Hale's office is safe. Emily leaned closer. Stay with US, Mark. Video, dashcam copied, evidence locker. His words dissolved into a cough. Daniel moved faster. The tunnel ended at a rusted grate half buried in ice above the frozen creek bed. He kicked it twice with his boot. The metal resisted, then broke free with a shriek that vanished beneath the wind. They emerged into pale pre-dawn light. The storm had finally weakened, leaving the forest still and silver, every branch bowed beneath snow. Somewhere far above, Shadow barked once. Then again, farther away, leading them. Daniel lifted Mark onto his back in a fireman's carry while Emily steadied him from the side. They followed the creek because Daniel knew snow over ice held fewer visible tracks. After several hundred yards, Emily's radio crackled for the first time all night. A faint voice broke through static. Officer Carter, repeat, status? Emily nearly sobbed with relief. She grabbed the radio. This is Carter. Deputy Ellis alive, injured. Sheriff Briggs compromised. Request state police, medical extraction, and federal notification. Miller Canyon, North Creek bed. Suspects armed. Static swallowed the reply, then the voice returned. Copy partial. Repeat sheriff compromised. Emily pressed the button again. Sheriff Briggs attacked Deputy Ellis. Send outside units only. Do not route through county dispatch. Daniel looked at her and nodded. Smart. Very smart. Then Shadow's bark cut through the trees again. Closer now, but strained. Daniel turned sharply. He's coming back. A shape burst from the timber line above the creek. Shadow stumbled into view, chest heaving, bandage torn loose, red staining the snow beneath his injured shoulder. Behind him, two men pushed through the pines, flashlights sweeping wildly. Shadow had led them in circles, but pain had finally slowed him. Daniel gently lowered Mark behind a fallen log. Emily knelt beside the deputy and drew her sidearm, both hands shaking only slightly. Daniel stepped into the open without a weapon raised, only a flare from his rescue pack in one hand. Shadow. The German shepherd heard him and changed direction instantly, limping down the slope. One of Briggs's men raised his flashlight and shouted, There! Daniel struck the flare. Crimson light exploded across the snow, blinding the men for one critical second and painting the forest the color of emergency. Shadow reached him and collapsed against his legs. Daniel caught him, one arm wrapping around the dog's chest. I got you, he whispered. A gunshot cracked somewhere behind the red glare, striking a tree above Daniel's shoulder and showering them with splinters. Emily fired one warning shot into the air, not at the men, but close enough to freeze them. State police are inbound, she shouted. Drop whatever you're carrying and get on your knees. The men hesitated. That hesitation saved them. From the ridge beyond the creek came the distant wail of sirens, faint but growing. Blue and red lights flickered through the trees like judgment arriving through snow. Briggs appeared at the top of the slope moments later, face twisted with fury beneath his hood. He saw Mark alive behind the log. He saw Emily's radio. He saw Daniel holding the wounded dog. And for the first time all night, the sheriff looked afraid. You don't understand what you're doing, Briggs called. Daniel lifted his eyes. I've heard that from better men than you. Shadow, weak and shaking, raised his head from Daniel's arms and growled. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The sound carried through the frozen creek bed with more truth than every lie Briggs had spoken. As the sirens drew closer and state troopers emerged through the trees with weapons lowered but ready, the first golden line of sunrise broke over Miller Canyon. Snow glittered across the ground, revealing tire tracks, drag marks, footprints, blood trails, and every path Briggs believed the storm had erased. Daniel looked down at Shadow, whose amber eyes were still open, still watching, still refusing to let go. "You did it, boy," he whispered. "You brought the whole mountain to court." The mountain had waited all night for the sun because some truths can only be read in daylight. Golden light slowly spilled across Miller Canyon, transforming the endless white wilderness into a silent witness no one could silence anymore. As the first rays crossed the frozen creek, every mark the blizzard had tried to conceal came alive. Tire tracks curved sharply away from the buried patrol SUV. Boot prints overlapped one another in frantic patterns. The drag marks leading from the wreck to the abandoned ranger cabin emerged beneath a thin layer of melting frost with startling clarity. Blood droplets frozen during the night now glowed like tiny crimson crystals against the snow. Daniel looked across the valley and quietly whispered. The mountain remembered everything. State troopers spread carefully through the scene, photographing every footprint before anyone disturbed it. Crime scene tape fluttered between blue spruce trees, while paramedics rushed toward Deputy Mark Ellis. Emily remained beside the stretcher until doctors assured her Mark would survive. Only then did she turn around, searching desperately through the gathering crowd. "Where's Shadow?" Daniel's heart tightened. He looked toward the place where the German Shepherd had collapsed against him only minutes earlier. The patch of snow was empty except for scattered paw prints leading toward a nearby stand of pines. Fresh blood dotted the trail. Without waiting for anyone, Daniel followed it. Emily caught up beside him. Neither of them spoke. The forest had become strangely peaceful. Birds had begun returning after the storm. Sunlight filtered through snow-covered branches in long golden beams that softened everything except the fear growing inside Daniel's chest. Shadow's tracks wandered unevenly now. The injured dog was no longer running. He was simply walking. Slowly, deliberately, as though one final destination still remained unfinished. Nearly 200 yards into the trees, Daniel stopped. Beneath a towering blue spruce overlooking the canyon stood Shadow. The German Shepherd had lowered himself carefully onto the snow, facing east toward the rising sun. His breathing came slowly, each breath visible in the cold morning air. He lifted his head when Daniel approached. His tail moved once. Just once. Daniel knelt immediately beside him, removing his gloves before placing one hand gently against the dog's neck. The pulse remained steady, though weak. "You're done working," Daniel whispered softly. "You can rest now." Shadow blinked slowly. His amber eyes remained locked on Daniel's face with complete trust. Emily knelt beside them, brushing melting snow away from the dog's wounded shoulder. Tears filled her blue eyes despite every attempt to remain composed. "He's freezing," she whispered. Daniel removed his heavy canvas jacket and wrapped it around Shadow's body. "Not today." Emily looked toward the medical teams farther down the canyon. "I'll get the vet." Before she could stand, a voice called from behind them. "Already here." A state police veterinarian hurried through the trees carrying emergency equipment. He examined Shadow quickly, then looked up with a relieved smile. "The bleeding looks worse than it is because he reopened the stitches. He's exhausted and hypothermic, but I think he'll make it if we move now." Daniel closed his eyes for one brief second. Relief washed through him so quietly that it almost hurt. Together, they lifted Shadow onto a rescue sled. Even then, the German Shepherd refused to look at anyone except Daniel. As they reached the command post, investigators had already begun comparing evidence recovered from Briggs's truck with the crime scene. Deputy Mark, despite obvious pain, insisted on giving his statement immediately. The dashcam backup hidden in the county evidence locker was retrieved before anyone inside the sheriff's office could destroy it. The recording showed Briggs forcing Mark's patrol SUV off the logging road after discovering that the deputy had uncovered documents linking Briggs and County Commissioner Victor Hale to fraudulent land acquisitions surrounding abandoned mineral rights worth millions of dollars. Hidden beneath those contracts were forged environmental reports, illegal property transfers, and evidence that anyone investigating the scheme had been intimidated into silence for years. Briggs believed the storm would bury both the deputy and the evidence forever. Instead, one wounded German Shepherd refused to abandon the man he had tried to save. Investigators also recovered strands of Shadow's fur embedded in the damaged front fender of Briggs's pickup, confirming the dog had been struck while trying to protect Mark after the crash. Emily stood quietly watching technicians collect each piece of evidence. "He wasn't running away," she said. Daniel looked toward the ambulance where Shadow rested beneath warm blankets. "He was trying to bring someone back." Hours later, as the sun climbed higher, Briggs was escorted from the canyon in handcuffs. For the first time since arriving, he looked toward Shadow lying inside the veterinary transport vehicle. The German Shepherd slowly opened his eyes. Their gaze met only for a moment. Briggs lowered his head first. Daniel noticed it without saying a word. Some guilt cannot survive being seen by the innocent. Before the convoy departed, Mark asked Daniel to come closer. His voice remained weak but clear. "That dog stayed with me all night after the crash." Daniel listened quietly. "Every time I lost consciousness, he'd bark until I woke up again. When I couldn't move, he lay across me to keep me warm." Mark swallowed hard. "He saved my life long before he found yours." Daniel looked through the ambulance window where Shadow finally rested peacefully beneath clean bandages. The German Shepherd had spent the entire night protecting strangers who had never even known his name. Snow had exposed the crime, but loyalty had exposed something even greater. Sometimes the bravest soul in the forest is the one who asks for nothing except one more chance to lead someone home. Grace does not always arrive as a miracle in the sky. Sometimes it limps into your life on wounded paws and refuses to leave until you remember who you are. 3 weeks after the storm, Black Ridge looked different beneath winter sunlight. The same mountains stood over the town. The same pines bent beneath snow. The same cold wind swept across courthouse steps and quiet streets. But something heavy had lifted. Sheriff Nolan Briggs resigned before his trial began, though resignation could not soften what the evidence had already proven. County Commissioner Victor Hale was arrested 2 days later after state investigators uncovered forged land records, hidden bank transfers, and years of intimidation buried beneath polite signatures and official stamps. Deputy Mark Ellis survived. Slowly, painfully, with Emily Carter visiting the hospital every evening after shift, carrying coffee he complained about but always drank. The investigation spread beyond Black Ridge, touching offices, contracts, and men who once believed rural silence was easier to buy than urban attention. But Daniel Brooks stopped following the news after the first week. He had seen enough powerful men fall to know justice often moved slower than grief, but moved all the same when honest hands kept pushing. His attention stayed where it mattered most. A veterinary recovery room warmed by soft lamps, clean blankets, and the steady breathing of a sable German Shepherd who had become the town's quiet legend before he could even stand again. Shadow healed slowly. The wound on his shoulder closed inch by inch. His strength returned first in his eyes, then in his appetite, then in the stubborn way he tried to follow Daniel every time the retired SEAL stood to leave. Emily officially searched every database for an owner. No chip, no collar record, no missing dog report. Nothing except stories from Mark about a stray German Shepherd who had appeared near the logging roads weeks earlier, sleeping beneath abandoned equipment, watching patrol vehicles from the tree line as if waiting for the right person to need him. On the 23rd morning, the veterinarian removed Shadow's final bandage. The dog stood carefully, tested his leg, then walked straight past Emily, past the vet, past the bowl of food on the floor, and pressed his head against Daniel's chest. Daniel closed his eyes and rested both hands in the thick fur behind Shadow's ears. No one in the room spoke. Some adoptions do not need paperwork to begin. Emily smiled through tears. Looks like he chose his handler. Daniel looked down at Shadow. Maybe he chose my house. No, Emily said softly. He chose your life. By spring, Daniel's cabin no longer felt like a place built for isolation. Emily visited often, sometimes in uniform, sometimes carrying groceries she pretended were leftovers. Mark came once he could walk with a cane, standing on the porch for a long time before kneeling awkwardly to thank Shadow in person. The German Shepherd licked his hand once, then leaned against Daniel as if embarrassed by too much praise. On the ridge behind the cabin, the snow melted slowly, revealing earth that had slept all winter. Daniel built a small wooden sign near the trailhead leading into Miller Canyon. It read simply, Shadow's Pass. Beneath it, in smaller letters, he carved, for every lost soul who kept walking. Months later, at a public ceremony outside the rebuilt sheriff's office, Mark returned to duty. Emily received a commendation for refusing to abandon evidence. Though she later told Daniel the medal felt less important than the night, she ignored dispatch and carried a bleeding dog through the storm. Daniel stood near the back of the crowd with Shadow sitting beside his leg, calm and alert beneath the bright Montana sky. When people clapped, Shadow looked up at Daniel as if unsure whether applause was a threat or whether. Daniel laughed quietly, the sound surprising him with how easy it came. That evening, snow began falling again, soft and gentle this time, not like the storm that had nearly buried them all. Daniel sat on the cabin porch while Shadow rested with his head across his boots. Emily stood beside the railing, watching flakes drift through the porch light like tiny pieces of peace. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. Daniel looked toward the dark line of pines where the whole truth had once waited beneath snow. "Every day. Does it still hurt?" Daniel's hand moved slowly over Shadow's back. The dog sighed, deep and content. "Yes," he said. Then, after a moment, "But not the same way." Emily nodded, understanding more than words could hold. Down in town, lights glowed warmly behind windows. In the distance, church bells rang once across the valley. Shadow lifted his head, listening. No danger, no warning. Just sound traveling through a world that had become a little kinder because one wounded dog refused to let evil disappear beneath white silence. Daniel looked at him and whispered, "You can rest now, buddy." Shadow blinked slowly, then placed one paw over Daniel's boot, as if answering that rest was easier when family stayed close. Some stories do not end when the crime is solved. They end when the wounded stop running, when the forgotten are given names, when a man who thought he had left his purpose behind finds it breathing beside him in the snow. And on that quiet Montana night, beneath a porch light glowing against the falling white, Daniel Brooks finally understood that Shadow had not only led them to justice, he had led them home.